Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for being still with us. It's incredible to really, we feel this full room. And the questions that appeared in the chats and in the room are really, all are very important. And they are very seldomly asked in cognitive science. There is a question about experience, there is a question about normativity, there is a question about values, there is the question about engagement. All of those things are not very frequent topics in cognitive sciences. Even though in 1993, was it, or 1990, the Varela Thompson Roche book, correct me, which year was it? Maybe 90, right?
1990.
91. Okay. Yeah, I thought closer to 90. All right. So this was basically a book that wanted, this work was to put experience back in cognitive science. And I think we have succeeded some in some aspects, because enactivism is one of the great successors of this line of thought. But we are still kind of far from where we would like to be. And we feel that there is a lot of work to be done. So let's start with a really easy question, the one about normativity. And it was yes, that was of course a joke. And we have two very nice questions from our participants in YouTube streaming. One is from Laura Moica. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. A question for Mark, but I think we can all try to answer it, or even relate the answers of the keynotes. How to accommodate normativity in nature? I mean, what should be the ontological status of normativity if physics and other natural sciences do not allow for it? And the other one that is close also in, well, yeah, let's start with this one. Let's not complicate this issue further. So how about, Mark, you solving this problem for us, and then if then Hannah or Sarah or Bert have anything to add, then we will go around. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, it's an absolutely central question. The standard answer presupposes Hume. So let me start with that one. Hume ostensibly argued that you cannot derive norms from facts. So either, if you're a pure physicalist, normativity is an illusion, or you've got two completely different metaphysical realms, not necessarily substance realms like Descartes, but some kind of completely different realms. Hume actually didn't give any argument. His argument consists of, quote, what seems altogether inconceivable, unquote. That's it. And what seems altogether inconceivable is how you could ever deductively get from strictly factual premises to normative conclusions. And people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what kind of an argument you could make for that, all within this framework of deductivity. I argue that Hume's argument is, insofar as we can reconstruct it, is in fact unsound, that it doesn't hold. And you can get a basic idea for this from the following. Forget deduction. When Hume was writing, all he knew about in the sense of definition, and notice that definition is a part of the deductive process, but it's a part of the deductive process that this literature doesn't pay any attention to. But all he knew about definition was definition as abbreviating something else. So bachelor abbreviates unmarried male or something like that. With an abbreviatory definition, if you have a conclusion that is valid from strictly factual premises, it may involve terms that weren't in the premise, but if it's a valid deduction, they have to have been defined in terms of other terms. And those terms maybe are also defined, which may be also defined, but ultimately all of the definitions have to ground out in the terms in the premise, which by assumption are factual. And you can't ever get from that to the normative. All you can ever get is new combinations of the factual. I think Hume's argument is actually quite valid, but it's unsound because it assumes that this is the only kind of definition. And I mean, I can get technical about this, but there's no point in getting technical about it right now. There is a different kind of definition that really got introduced in the 19th century. It first got introduced formally within formal logic, but now we can talk about it dynamically and even experientially. It's implicit definition. Mm-hmm. And implicit definition does not allow these kinds of back translations. So implicit definition does not tell you how to handle normativity within a physicalist framework, but it undoes the Humean barrier to being able to do that. So you still need a model of how to do it, and a model of how to do it, or at least a model that I claim shows how to do it, is a central part of what I've been working on for a while. I don't know if we want to get into the details of that right now, but the point is it's an emergence model, and the split between fact, physics, etc., and normativity is not a split. It's in fact a hierarchy of many different kinds of emergences. So I would argue anyway.
All right. So excuse me for being maybe super simplistic, but one kind of normativity that you can think of is that, well, something is alive, it must have been doing something right. And I wanted to pass it to Hanne. How do you see the normativity issue from the enactivist perspective? And if you would like to show the sources maybe of our worry about it that are somewhere else than Marx, I don't know.
Yeah, I always find this question so difficult to answer because I don't really know often what it means. People mean different things by normativity. In relation to my work, sometimes they mean where are the social norms according to which we act, and you're talking only about individuals interacting and the social norms don't seem to be there. And I think meanwhile we've worked on ways of incorporating social norms and our interactions with social institutions and patterns and roles and so on. But I mean, for an active viewpoint on cognition, sense making is completely suffused with normativity, and even the most minimal living being interacts with the world on the basis of norms that are very utterly basically part of its being because it's always a particular body that has particular possibilities for interacting with the world and not others. And so there's immediately a perspective on the world because of the material, physical being that it is. And so norms and values suffuse the whole interaction with the world. And I almost would like to maybe ask the question the other way around. I mean, how could we get anywhere without beginning from normativity, especially if we're thinking about cognition and sense making? And it seems to me that confusion about that starts from treating nature as if it's some kind of dead, abstract, static, divided, separated thing that we have approached in that way. But actually, there are many different ways of thinking about many different epistemologies that exist in the world that do not start from that starting point, and so don't have that problem of having to bring in normativity.
So, Mark, would you agree that norms, because both what Hanne said and when thinking in general about living beings, it would seem that a norm is something very primitive and basic. Would it be basic in your ontology then?
Well, yes and no. I would agree that normativity is involved in even the very simplest living things. Simple kinds of normativity are emergent even in single cells. Everything psychological, everything biological is absolutely saturated with normativity. And there are so many different kinds of normativity, and they relate to each other in so many different ways. It's really a tragedy that we haven't even tried to really study normativity very much. My own argument is that the emergence of normativity, even in the single cells, is dependent deeply on a process metaphysics. You cannot account for emergence at all without process metaphysics. And there's many, many arguments about that. But suppose you adopt a process metaphysics that maybe opens up some possibilities of emergence, but it also raises questions or allows the raising of questions. What about the emergence of very, very simple kinds of normativity? And my own argument is that normativity basically emerges roughly in the following sense. Process involves change. Everything is always changing, unlike a particle model or a substance model or something like that. So if anything is going to persist in time in a process metaphysics, that has to be explained. And in general, the things that will persist at all are patterns or organizations of process. And there are two fundamental different kinds, there are more than two, but there are two fundamental different kinds of relatively persistent organizations of process. One kind is like atoms, where they're in an energy well. So they'll stick around and engage in this furious pattern of process for, billions of years, unless something comes along and disrupts them. But another, and if you take one of these and isolate it and let it go to thermodynamic equilibrium, it's perfectly happy. It'll sit there for, 10 billion years. But another kind of persistence is far from thermodynamic equilibrium processes, like a candle flame. You cannot isolate a candle flame because it will go to equilibrium just like the atom does. But when the candle flame goes to equilibrium, it ceases to exist. So there are multiple kinds of existences that are necessarily far from equilibrium because their ontology is constituted in that. And in order to continue to exist, they have to interact with their worlds. They have to exchange energy, material, so on and so on and so on. And so you've got a fundamental asymmetry here at the level of the basic physics, which I argue underlies the emergence of the asymmetry between functional, dysfunctional, normative, unnormative. And in particular, this is just an intuition. It takes a whole lot more work to be careful. The intuition I would suggest is something that contributes to the persistence of far from thermodynamic equilibrium processes and conditions is thereby functional relative to the persistence of that process. That itself already takes more discussion, but it just gives a kind of intuition of where I try to go with it.
Right. So I would take it to, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, and then I just want to reemphasize that that is a very, very simple kind of normativity. And as I said in one of my slides, there's so many, many, many others. We don't have any inventory even. And no inventory would be possible because new kinds of normativities come along. But, there's function, dysfunction, there's true, false, there's rational, irrational, there's, and on and on and on. And then the social level, according to what I argue, is its own further emergent level of ontology.
Mm-hmm. So I think I would take this straight to Bert, because those kinds of normativities that you listed sound very much like Bert's what Bert was calling values, and Bert, what would you say? Do you see? Because what Mark suggested is actually something quite incredible, which is the origin of normativity, the very beginning, which I thought would be really very difficult to pin down. But you have a slightly different view on that, do you, Bert?
Yeah, this is nothing but big questions here. Yeah, I think that one of the things to start with about the physics, we think about physics not being normative, but in fact, the physical world has beings like us doing what we're doing right now. And physics has to account for that, just like it has to account for everything else. And so normativity is in the stuff that physics has to explain. So emergence, some kind of story of emergence has to be there. And it presumably has to go back to origins. And where the origin, that's a standard question I get asked a lot. It's where do values come from? And what people usually want, it's usually social psychologists. They want me to say it comes from culture, it's social norms or something of that. In my, talking about laws, rules, values, and goals and stuff, social norms are rules. The values in the sense I want to use it are something deeper than that. It's the basis on which we would ever develop social norms, choose to change social norms, figure out how to coordinate social norms that might be in conflict with each other. We have to have something bigger than rules, than norms, than conventions. And so I actually, the first time I ever got asked this question was probably 25 years ago. And somewhere off the top of my head, I said, I think values come out of the Big Bang. And I actually referred to clarity, coherence, comprehensiveness, and complexity. At the beginning there's in the universe, there's no particles. I know particles don't actually exist, as Mark has pointed out, but typically we think about that. There's no particles, there's no differentiation, there are no forces, there's no movement yet, and yet now we think it's an expanding universe, and it's an evolving universe. It's a complexifying universe. So there you've got at least some kind of normativity in the very physics, it seems to me, of the universe, that then new levels, as Mark just was pointing out, keep emerging. And then we have localizations. Social norms are just sort of localized approximations of things that to solve coordinative problems that we have relative to values realizing issues that we're facing in our lives and stuff. So the one other thing, and then I'll stop here, is to go back to Hume's thing. Is Hume's, I think Mark's absolutely right. From a logical point of view, Hume's dead on there. That is, you cannot logically get from is to ought kind of statements. But if you look at any kind of perception, action, skill that we engage in, a simple example I use regularly is carrying. Carrying, to carry something, is to perceive where something is and to move it to where it ought better to be. And so it's, you step across the gap, supposedly, that Hume and G.E. Moore and others sort of tried to put there and say these are just two disparate realms that don't get anywhere. Is you can't define what any of the things psychology studies are. You can't say what remembering is. You can't say what driving is. You can't say what conversing is without making without a normative ontology.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Can I maybe because it seems that the basic notion of what values not norms, values are, because the normativity is rather about values, because when we start talking about norms, it very quickly is interpreted as social norms, which are rather rules. So we are talking still about this very basic kind of normativity, and it seems that it's quite compatible between the three of you, maybe except for the origins, but this far from equilibrium, persistence, well, the organism has to do something right in order to do it, and has to resist those forces. So I wanted to ask also Sarah, if you, even though there is a lot of social normativity already there with reading, for example, because you study engaged social processes, but it seems that they are based in something much more basic than social norms and rules. And if you think about value realizing in reading, you don't think in social norms, do you? You rather, I don't know. I don't want to suggest what you think, but
No, I think that, so in social life, I mean, the emergence of normativity relates very much to human dialogicality, that we are born as social creatures who must organize ourselves in ways of engaging in order to sustain those functional practices. And I think that somehow, I mean, so I'm interested in understanding the mechanisms that fuels imagination, for instance, as one way of sustaining that kind of practice in social interaction. Language is, of course, very interesting to study as such. The sound didn't go on. I was just like thinking a little bit here. No, so the last part of the question that you asked, what was that? I was not thinking of. You said something.
I was just wondering, where do we get from? Because where do we get from realizing values, basic values, some organismic values to the social normativity? But of course, it's a huge step that I didn't want you to maybe construct the whole process, which I think Mark has done actually in his writing. But I wanted rather to see from the point of view of cognitive ethnographer, because psychologists get criticized that they look into for values in the wrong places. So where do you look for values? I mean, you said in basic dialogicity. This is definitely something that I'm not sure we would call social norms, or rather this basic values. But in terms of methods, how do we get to the basic normativity, let's say?
Yeah, I don't know if I completely understand, but I think that somehow what drives us when we engage in this particular kind of activity and what kind of sustains that is that we become able to take a different kind of perspective on who we are and what we are doing. So just understanding of reading is something that we do to realize a certain set of values or to achieve a goal or something like that. There's something more deep at stake about what it is to be human and why we engage in particular kind of practices. And it is quite interesting because we weren't really, I mean, evolutionarily designed to be a reading person as such. So there's something interesting in why the brain somehow adapted to be able to engage with symbols in that particular way and in alphabets, and it has to be adaptive somehow. I mean, so why are we doing it? Why are we engaging in this particular kind of activity? And I think it's because it does something. It's not just about a one-to-one understanding of what a story tells us, but because we are able to do something with that particular engagement, material engagement, that moves us. I mean, so that is an interesting change that we suddenly, quite recently, actually became able to engage with symbols in this particular way. And it has to have a function somehow that I don't think I will be able to exactly explain what that is. but the best explanation is probably not the one that we have already, that it's about information processing as such, but that we can create, we can't somehow engage with our own thinking in a way that is very different from social interaction, for instance, or other kind of interactions. I don't know, I mean, I don't think I exactly answered your question, but I'm not sure I completely understood it. So
well, yeah, I think in a sense you did, and also you made come to the foreground something very I think important that never occurred to me, how much engagement as a concept is close to the concept of normativity. Because if all is process and all processes are engagements with other processes, then of course what keeps them from falling apart, what keeps them engaged, is probably some kind of this basic normativity. So I don't know if you would like to add to the value and normativity question still in this light, in this light of engagement, and how absolutely basic it has become. I'm not sure, Mark, if it's so basic for your approach, because well, it is basic to engage with reality, with the world, but is it basic also to engage with other forms of or processes?
Depends on what you mean by basic, but basically, yes.
I mean, it's impossible to talk about normativity. Is it possible to talk about normativity without the concept of engagement?
I don't think so, because that's the whole point of far from equilibrium systems, that they have to be engaged somehow with their environments in order to exist and to continue to exist. And there's many, many levels of complexity for that. So if you've got a chemical bath and you're just pumping stuff in it, and it's engaged in self-organization, it will only continue those self-organizational processes if things get continually pumped into it. But that's a dependence on the external world. If you look at a candle flame, you've got something more than that, because the candle flame creates conditions for its own continued existence. It generates heat above combustion threshold heat, vaporizes wax, brings in oxygen, gets rid of waste products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's what I call self-maintenance. And this notion of self-maintenance actually goes all the way back to Aristotle. He basically talked about it. But then there's another level, which I call recursive self-maintenance, which I don't think is in Aristotle per se. And it's illustrated by even the simplest cell, simplest living thing. So Don Campbell's bacterium that would swim and keep swimming, or tend to keep swimming so long as it's going up a sugar gradient. But if it finds itself going down the sugar gradient, it will tumble and then try swimming again. Notice, swimming is functional for the bacterium if it's going up a sugar gradient, but it's dysfunctional for the bacterium if it's going down the sugar gradient. So what the bacterium does is to maintain the condition of being self-maintenance. It shifts what it's doing in order to accommodate shifts in its orientation to its world. And so I call it recursive self-maintenance. And you know, it just keeps getting more and more and more complex. But one of the senses in which it gets complex much later on in macroevolution is a whole nother level of emergence, and that is the level of social emergence. So there you have engagement of a different kind, and engagements at that level share a whole lot with engagements with the non-social realm, but they also have they realize a whole new ontology. They realize a social reality that isn't there if you're just, you know, kicking a rock or something like that. And so you have new senses of engagement at that level. And those new senses of engagement are, I don't know how much of this to try to get into right here, but I would argue that persons are themselves emergent at this social level. So when you engage with other persons in a sense that creates its own new level of emergence, you are thereby engaged in your own emergence as well.
Right. That's a very good illustration how difficult it will be to model this someday. Although I know that you, Mark, are trying. So I hope that we will develop this in one way. Excuse me?
I said it's all there in my book manuscript.
Okay. Okay. Will it appear before 2021 so we can...
I frankly don't know. I've been working on it for 30 years.
Suna, you wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to add one comment that goes back to what was said before. Mark said something about, so I mean, we talk about the cognitive science and the psychology, and I very much like that formulation that I think Bert was the one who uttered it, that psychology requires a normative ontology, which of course goes hand in hand with that process ontology that Mark talks about. So I think one thing that is really important to add here is how that feeds back into the kind of work done in the humanities, because humanities have always had this kind of preoccupation with meaning and like the hermeneutics and stuff like that. So I think these kind of perspectives add something new to how to do work in the humanities. And so, for instance, like I'm doing a project with some colleagues on psychotherapy, and psychotherapy is a very good example of where you need to have normativity and a process ontology and also values, because psychotherapy is a social practice where you need to have a directionality. You need the whole purpose of engaging in psychotherapy is for the patient to become better, to have less pain, to feel better, and so on. So to account for that, you of course first of all need to have a process ontology, so you can talk about that change is indeed possible. And also you need to account for the normativity, that something is better than something else. It is better to not be in pain than to be in pain. So then if you go one step further and look at the values realizing going on in psychotherapy, it's really interesting to see the kind of balancing of values going on there. Because on the one hand, you need to, for the therapist, you need to have a setting where the patient feels safe, feels that you can actually share your inner thoughts. And if you believe in inner thoughts might, I don't know where the thoughts are. Anyway, you need to have this kind of feeling that you can share your concerns and your fantasies and your desires and all of that kind of interesting stuff going on in psychotherapy. So you need to create a room where there's a kind of trust and the feeling of safety. But at the same time, if it's just a room where the patient feels at ease and you can share, then there'll be no pushing, there'll be no development, no change. So at the same time, the therapist also has to heckle, might not be the right word, but still needs to do something to make it less comforting to be in therapy. So you cannot do like totally safe therapy, because then there'll be no change. You cannot make totally like not sure what words to like confrontational therapy, because then the patient will drop out of therapy because it's not a safe room. So you need to really, as a therapist, to balance on that in between. And I think that's where the values and the change and the process ontology comes together. And if you, okay, there you are. You just disappeared from my screen. I could see myself, which was nice, but you disappeared. Okay, if you add that kind of perspective to, for instance, work done in interaction analysis or in the language sciences, then you're beyond the kind of things you normally would look for namely, so how are the microsocial organization of conversations, for instance, or the kind of vocalization patterns or whatever, because then you're tied up to talk about, so what are the values governing or guiding the actual conversing in psychotherapy, for instance. And you don't normally ask that question in the humanities. So I think that's where the humanities have so much to learn from taking the perspectives of, in this case, Bert and Mark and so on, but also the other way around, because I think that's also a perspective that feeds back into our understanding of so psychology and cognitive science, because it also adds this perspective of how the human way of engaging in these processes are so saturated with meaning constructions that are not only situated there, but has a lineage or a history that belongs to a cultural or socio-cultural dimension. I think that's very important to get into play here.
Yes.
Short comment.
Yes. That's maybe our job to put it in such terms that would be easy to read and acceptable, because I don't think we are doing it enough to I mean,
and
to
who do you mean by we?
Who
do you mean by we right now?
I don't know. We people here, maybe we who want to build the bridges between the realms. Sarah wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, it was just because we were discussing about the different disciplines and the interest in well, somehow in psychology, the aim is functionality, and when you talk about normativity, that is so tied up with the function. And I was just thinking whether within the humanities there are things that, for instance, that it makes sense to describe many practices that we do by that terms in relation to function and sustaining the practices and the way normativity kind of drives that practice. But there might also be aspect, or I question whether there might be aspects that are non-functional or more aesthetic or more well, not driven exactly by the same logic that function somehow relates to. So normativity is more difficult to capture in these kind of trajectories or whatever. I mean, it's just because it's always about function, and the functionality or the outcome is either appropriate or non-appropriate. But there's so much going on, for instance, in the reading. So as Bert also mentioned, that there are many things that goes on at the same time. So at one point we are reading because we are maintaining a particular practice and sustaining that practice through the application of rules and norms and expectations and stuff like that. But there are also something that goes on that can't be captured with or understood by the frame of normativity, I would say, and that's also what intrigues me. So what is going on there that is so unique, and the particular ways of engaging that can't be, I don't know, but can that be described all through social normativity and a criterion of function, for instance? I'm not sure about that.
And that's a very good point. And I know that activists also have a problem with this notion. Hanne?
Yeah, that's a really good question, I think. But from an inactive point of view, we would say that those things are definitely part of living. So aesthetics and joy and pleasure, and also the opposite, being disgusted, or I mean, these are things that in living play such a big role, and we react to them immediately as well. So to just speak about functions is also in that reduced psychological sense is an unnecessary reduction.
But they can be realized in so many different ways that they aren't necessarily social. I mean, so I mean, how can you talk about social normativity when you and I could react in very different ways? I mean,
I don't mean social. I think this goes with the normativity of a living being also, which is related to an individual's experience, and that for me is basically social. But I also don't think that we need to agree on the norms for there to be for them to be able to be described.
Mark, would you like to add to the functionality? Because it seems that there is another. Sarah said that she sees so many things, so many processes that are realizing values that we would have difficulty describing as functional, and it seemed that functionality was one of the sort of key values that set the norms in your account. I don't know if I said it correctly. It didn't sound correctly, sorry, but I hope that just tell me how far function can go when normativity goes.
Function isn't the only thing going on, and if you interpret function in a strictly instrumental fashion, like function toward a goal, you know, that exists, and I completely agree that it's limited, much too limited. But that means that other kinds of things have to be accounted for. So like eating ice cream might be functional in some sense, nutrients, energy, whatever. But the pleasure of eating ice cream is not itself functional, and that needs to be accounted for. And aesthetic motivation, most generally, is not it may serve a function in some real broad sense because excuse me, it functions to induce us to explore things and so on and so on. But the aesthetic experience is not itself for the sake of some function. It's more akin to, although much more complex, to the pleasure of eating ice cream. And so, yeah, all of those things need to be taken care of and understood and modeled. And given my particular bent, that means I want to have an ontological model of what those processes are. And they are processes, they're not states. But if you're interested, I could say more about it, but that maybe takes us far afield. But basically, I agree with the comments that function in the sense of instrumentality won't get us everywhere we need to go.
Right. There are some comments from Dongping. Would you like to say something on this, or can I read them, move to them? Okay. So Dongping asks, normativity and values at present are in, I think it's to you, Bert, so you can read it also on the bottom of the chat. Normativity and values at present are in paradoxical relationship in values realizing activity. Bert, would you say so? And then Dongping, is this the other part of the question? In practice, truth is being shaped by strong voices and power dynamics in circumstances, but the truth may turn into suffering for less powered individuals. What is the paradox that is brought up here, Bert?
I'm not sure. Yeah, Dongping we'll have to make that clearer for me, what she means values at present in normativity. As Marcus pointed out, normativity is a very broad term that gets used that's operative at many, many levels. If you mean it in the sense of norms, social norms, or something which I see as rules and values, is, yeah, those kind of tensions occur all the time. So that's exactly what's at stake in something like an Ash dilemma or something like this. There's all kinds of situations in which we feel a tension between what the rules are and what seems to be called for in terms of right action or right ways of thinking or right ways of reasoning or whatever. And that's where creativity and critique and community and all of that come in, and caring and commitment come into play. Is working out those tensions. Precisely the thing, to go to the truth example there, which I think maybe she means that as an example there of that, is precisely that example I used referring possibly to people who are real and living, not just fictional ones, is that tension is if we don't actually have something that we, for lack of a better term, call truth, that's something bigger than a society or bigger than individuals or bigger than my interests or what I like or whatever, then what you're left with, all you have is you can't have an argument. You can't have a discussion. You can't have a democracy, for example. What you have is power plays. So you simply move to oppression and violence. And if you're in a minority, you probably try to escape or hide out or you muzzle yourself so you won't speak up and say what you really think. So that's precisely the kind of the political situation in which we increasingly find ourselves, is claims about alternate realities and my facts and your facts and stuff. I think it's very ironic, though, for psychologists who have contributed massively to the notion that values are just personal preferences or biological preferences that are kind of wired in or something like that. And in reinforcement theory is it is about pleasure. So they think, behaviors think pleasure is perfectly functional. That's how you decide what's right and wrong. It's what gave me pleasant feelings after I did it. Whether that's good or not in some other frame of reference is a quite different question. So it's without some kind of larger framework here, then truth, then you can't have conversations and arguments. You just have violence. You just have oppression. You just have people fleeing for the doorways or something if they're or trying to get out of the relationship or something like it, trying to disengage in some kind of way.
It seems that Dongping, with her question, actually brought the discussion back to Hanne de Jager, because this question, how can the less empowered people be truer to themselves and to the group when they are in this kind of violent relationship, is a very good one. Hanne, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I would actually. This is something that we ask also in our book, in the Linguistic Bodies book, about how to improve participation. And I think the question is really well put. How can the less empowered people be truer to themselves and to the group? And so this takes the onus away from the oppressor and from the dominant group. And that's exactly right, I think. And this is something that I've learned from looking at First Nations epistemologies in Canada. And there, what I see happening is that they are against, they are for resurgence of their culture, and they're against reconciliation, because reconciliation, I'm just putting it very quickly, but reconciliation can still be dominated by the government position, whereas resurgence means going back to your own knowledge, your own epistemology, finding your own ground in your own epistemology. And they call it, actually, there's a theoretical term that Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard have developed. It's called grounded normativity. It means understanding your epistemology, so First Nations epistemology, and from there, once you've gone deep enough into that, being able to dialogue with governments about treaty negotiations and so on, but focusing on your standpoint and your understanding, rather than thinking that you have to think in the kind of governmentalese and law-like ways of thinking that is put on you by the oppressor. But actually it's about realizing that your epistemology is the one to understand and from where to begin speaking.
And you can probably go back to your epistemology only. I wonder how it's done. What are the tools for doing this? Because you probably can do it only by living.
By living, and also by shutting your ears to the dominant discourse, I think. By being quite radical in that way. Of course, the dominant discourse is there and you have to relate to it at some point, but there's also sometimes, really like, no, I'm not going to listen now, and I'm going to be here with my approach. And develop that, and to be able from there to be better in dialogue, and to have a stance to be recognized more, and that, yeah. So that's from the point of view of the oppressed or the less empowered people. And then we also need to talk about the other side. But I think maybe leave it there, because I think to put it that way is very helpful, actually, and important.
I think we will come back to this issue, because what seems to be ringing here also is this kind of necessity of engaging and disengaging for there to be cognition. Again, some dialectic process that we probably have to come back to. And I would like to come back to it tomorrow, because this has become a central issue for Vasudevi Reddy, who will be presenting tomorrow. And also it seems that it's at the crux, not in terms of oppression maybe, but in general in terms of an individual being a part of the group, and having always to find this interplay between the values of both, right? So we can develop this. All right, we have 5 minutes left. We have solved the normativity problem, so we can move to the next one, which can be solved in 5 minutes. Let's talk about now that, of course. Maybe let's have this last 5 minutes for having a quick word about how exactly to study the normativity, and this discussion will naturally move to tomorrow, because tomorrow I would like also to devote part of the panel to the role of science in all this that we are talking about. But just talking, I mean, Bert already talked about how it's difficult to study values, how it's difficult to study what normativity processes are at play. But do you have anything to add here in those couple of minutes? Bert, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, Mark's point earlier is quite right, that we need lots of kinds of ways to do this. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Lots of ways to do this. There's no one right way. There's no set of rules for how to do values realizing research or how to take normativity seriously. I think simply, and this is, again, one of Mark's deep points, is psychology has just doesn't believe in theory for the most part. And their idea of it is a substitution, it's an overview of my research program for the last 20 years or something, or what my lab's been doing in a longer time frame than last week or last month. It's, you know, we've got to take theory seriously and not see it as just armchair philosophy, but as a serious questioning. But to ask simply to make yourself ask the questions. What are the values here? So to go back to the reading or something, why do we read? Why do we? I think partly I would go at it is, I think it's partly why language is there, is we can perceive and act at a distance. If I talk to you, I can learn something about things you've seen and things you've done I haven't done and may never do. So it's enlarged my world, it's complexified my world, it's enriched my world and stuff. Writing scales it up again, because now we can do it with more reliability over generations. So I can learn from Aristotle. I can engage with Aristotle. Before writing, that was extraordinarily difficult to do. And now we take it for granted, and certainly in academic circles, that we can do those kinds of things. We can learn about other geographies, other worlds. That's I think at bottom why we end up reading.
All right, we were talking also, Bert, with you earlier about how important it is to sort of put the system at the verge of its stability, for example, or to observe a system for a longer time in order to see what dynamics is at play there, what the system is drawn by or pulled by. And this is something also which is missing from cognitive science, to see a process as a process and not as a series of points. So maybe here we can add something. Hannah, would you like to add something? I see you leaning. Okay. So if anybody would like to, Sarah?
No, it was just the last comment that you mentioned there. I mean, I think, Bert, you're right in exactly that's one of the reasons why we read it. That's also one of my initial questions. Why read at all? Why grab the text and so on? And also in relation to one of the things that we can see when we use cognitive ethnography, for instance, is exactly that this kind of flow is punctuated by interesting breaks or by small-scale events that become interesting to observe over time. So that's exactly what we're interested in. What are these breaks doing in the flow on a longer time scale? So I think that's really an important question to, yeah.
Good.
It's just a comment.
Okay, I think we will finish for now. Let's once more thank all the speakers and all the chairs and all the how do you call it? Discussants, probably, and also all the participants who asked really wonderful questions. So whatever you do, like this. And we will see each other in 12 hours sharp. So thanks, Jelle. I can see some. We missed some of the very nice comments from Joanna Jurewicz. We will go back to everything is written, and we will try to go back to those questions tomorrow. And please feel free to go to one room this time. We opened 3 rooms and it was, I think, too many. So people were going back and forth and not interacting. Tomorrow we will open 1 room, but even now we can leave 1 room open. So you can go there and have a beer taken from your fridge and drinking it on the beach in the Gather town if you wish. So once more, thank you all, and see you tomorrow at 8 in the morning, Polish Warsaw time, and your respective times at your places. Bert and Mark, we won't hold the grudge if you won't be with us, because it will be I think some 2 in the morning, in the middle of the night.
Yes, we will.
Knowing sooner, yes, he will, but he holds grudges all the time. So, yeah. So of course, feel free even to you can put us on the headphones while you sleep, for example. That might be one way to participate. Thank you all, and see you in 12 hours. Bye-bye.
Hello.
Bye.